Ever wondered what it would be like to follow in the footsteps of ancient explorers, like searching for the source of the Nile?
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine traveling over 4,000 miles just to find out where this massive river begins.
Wow.
It's no wonder Asimov calls it in the Egyptians a river out of the ordinary. It's like the Nile itself was this ancient mystery just begging to be unraveled.
Yeah, and unraveling it, I think, as Asimov does so brilliantly in the Egyptians, is it helps us understand just how much this single geographic feature shaped an entire civilization. I mean, the Nile wasn't just water to them. It was their lifeline, their highway, their calendar. It's almost as if this isolation allowed them to develop in a way no other civilization could.
That's so true. Imagine, on one side, you have this lush green strip of land where crops flourish, and then on the other, it's just desert. It's like their entire world was this narrow ribbon along the Nile. But then Asimov talks about this fascinating shift. While many cultures were still figuring out how to hunt and gather effectively, the Egyptians went all in on agriculture. More food, more people, right?
Exactly. But with more mouths to feed, you need a system. And that's where things get really interesting with ancient Egypt, because they had to work together to harness that power, the Nile's power. So they created these incredible irrigation systems, canals, these intricate ways to manage water on a massive scale. And this wasn't just about survival. It required a level of societal organization that was way ahead of its time.
Okay, so picture this. You're in the Fayum Oasis, a fertile pocket of land fed by the Nile, and you take one step, just one step, and suddenly you're in the middle of a scorching desert. Asimov describes this contrast so vividly. It's like you can almost feel the heat yourself. But it's not just the imagery, it's what this tells us about the Egyptians. They chose to build their civilization right on this razor's edge between abundance and harshness.
And this choice, as Asimov highlights, forced them to innovate. He points to the Fayum's Lake Moeris, which was a hotbed for early settlements, even before, the rise of the pharaohs. But as North Africa became drier over time, the lake began to shrink. And this wasn't some gradual change happening over millennia. We're talking a few generations that had to adapt to a dramatically changing environment. Sound familiar?
Yeah. It's like even back then, they were dealing with the impacts of climate change. It makes you realize just how resilient they had to be. And speaking of resilience, Asimov mentions they were using a complex writing system, hieroglyphs, as early as 3000 BC. Can you imagine the dedication it took to create and master something that intricate so early on?
It speaks to their intellectual capabilities, for sure. But Asimov subtly introduces a really thought-provoking point here. He argues that while this early sophistication in writing was impressive, it also made them resistant to change. Think about it. They invested so much into this system that moving to something simpler, even if more efficient, would have seemed like a step backward.
It's like us clinging to the imperial system instead of switching to the metric system, right? We know it makes more sense, but it's just so ingrained.
Exactly. Asimov brilliantly uses that parallel to highlight how even the most advanced civilizations can be held back by their own success. They become almost protective of their achievements, even when change is necessary for progress.
That's a fascinating insight, and it makes you wonder, what other innovations did the ancient Egyptians cling to, even as the world around them changed? And how did this impact their civilization in the long run?
Well, to understand that, we need to delve into how these brilliant independent communities scattered along on the Nile eventually coalesced into one of history's most enduring empires, the rise of Egypt itself.
Okay, so let's talk about unification. We're moving from scattered communities to the birth of a nation. Asimov brings up this almost mythical figure, Menemes. Or was it Narmer?
Ah, yes, the great unifier. Even Asimov, with all his historical knowledge, can't resist a good mystery. Did Menes or Narmer conquer his way to uniting Upper and Lower Egypt? Or was he more of a diplomat who brought everyone together peacefully? It's a question that still has historians scratching their heads.
Wait, back up. For those of us who aren't ancient Egyptian geography buffs, what exactly are Upper and Lower Egypt?
Great question. Essentially, imagine the Nile as a giant map. Lower Egypt is in the north, where the Nile fans out into the Nile Delta before emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. Upper Egypt is further south, encompassing the long, narrow valley shaped by the Nile as it flows north from its source.
So Menes, or Narmer, whoever he was, managed to bring these two distinct regions under one rule, a feat that must have been incredibly difficult given the distances and cultural differences involved.
Absolutely. And Asimov suggests that outside influence may have played a role. He proposes that immigrants from Asia, who had already mastered large-scale warfare and new technologies, might have brought these concepts to the relatively peaceful Egyptians.
Hold on, are you saying that the unification of Egypt might have been partly due to immigrants? That's a perspective you don't often hear. And it makes you wonder if Menes or Narmer learned some new tricks from these newcomers, which helped him unite Upper and Lower Egypt.
It's certainly a possibility, and it highlights how interconnected the ancient world was, even back then. Unfortunately, Asimov laments that excavating in Lower Egypt is like trying to find a needle in a haystack made of mud. Centuries of silt deposits have buried many archaeological sites, making it difficult to piece together a complete picture of this era.
So we're left with more questions than answers. But isn't that part of what makes studying ancient civilizations so fascinating? Knowing that we may never have all the answers, but getting these tantalizing glimpses into the past. Speaking of glimpses, where does Asimov take us next on our journey through ancient Egypt?
Okay, so we have a newly unified Egypt, but what did their culture look like back then? Was it already the Egypt we see in the movies, with grand temples and elaborate rituals?
You might be surprised. Asimov paints a picture of early Egyptian religion that's very different from those familiar images we have. It all started with a deep reverence for nature, which makes sense considering, their reliance on the Nile for survival. They had these animal-based deity, almost like echoes of their hunter-gatherer past.
Right.
Can you imagine a world where gods took the form of crocodiles and falcons? It's a far cry from the grand temples and pyramids we usually associate with ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
It's like catching a glimpse of their belief system in its infancy, right? So how did they go from worshiping crocodiles to building those massive monuments?
Well, as their civilization evolved, so too did their beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And Asimov highlights this fascinating shift towards sun worship, with Ra emerging as this dominant deity, and makes you realize the sun was more than just a celestial object to the Egyptians. It was the source of life, warmth, the predictable rhythm of their world. It was everything.
It's like their understanding of the divine grew in tandem with their observations of the natural world.
Absolutely.
But Asimov doesn't stop at sun worship. He delves into the myth of Osiris, a story that's captivated people for millennia.
Oh, yeah.
And for good reason, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. The Osiris myth is so powerful.
Yeah.
Because it's deeply intertwined with the Egyptians' own lives. Osiris, the god of agriculture and rebirth, dies, is brought back to life each year, mirroring the cycle of the Nile's floods, the growth of crops. Imagine the impact this story must have had on the Egyptians.
Oh, yeah.
This idea that even in death, there was the promise of renewal.
It makes you wonder, did their belief in the afterlife, this idea of life after death, influence their burial practices?
You're spot on. This belief in an afterlife, as Asimov explains, led the Egyptians to develop a practice that would, shall we say, inadvertently advance their scientific knowledge mummification. They weren't just burying their dead, they were attempting to preserve them for eternity.
It's amazing to think that the desire to cheat death could lead to such scientific innovation. But hold on, didn't you mention earlier that the word mummy has a rather unexpected origin?
It does indeed. Asimov, always one to uncover these linguistic quirks, traces the word back to the Persian word for fish. It seems the Persians used a fish-based resin in their own embalming practices, and the term just kind of stuck, eventually becoming synonymous with the Egyptian process. It's a reminder that even in ancient times, cultures interacted. They influenced each other in these really surprising ways.
It's like finding a connection between two seemingly unrelated things, those aha moments that make exploring history so rewarding. But let's get back to the Egyptians. This elaborate process of mummification, it wasn't just about preserving the body, was it?
You're right. Asimov makes this brilliant connection between mummification and the Egyptians' understanding of the human body. Because to successfully preserve a body, you need a deep understanding of anatomy, herbs, chemical processes. They were essentially conducting early experiments in chemistry and biology, all driven by this desire to ensure a comfortable afterlife for the deceased.
So this macabre practice might have inadvertently propelled them centuries ahead in medicine and science.
It's possible.
That's an incredible thought. They were so focused on the afterlife that they stumbled upon groundbreaking discoveries about this life. And speaking of elaborate burials, their desire for grandeur didn't end with mummification, did it? Asimov takes us on a journey through their most iconic structures. The pyramids.
Ah, yes. Asimov starts with the step pyramid of Djoser, a structure so revolutionary for its time that it still boggles the mind. And it was all thanks to the ingenuity of one man, Imhotep. Not only was he a brilliant architect, but as Asimov points out, he was later revered as a god of medicine. Talk about an overachiever.
Imhotep sounds like the ultimate Renaissance man. thousands of years before the Renaissance even happened.
Exactly.
But the pyramids, as Asimov reminds us, didn't just appear overnight. It was a gradual evolution of techniques and ambition, like a civilization-scale learning curve etched in stone.
Precisely. And this learning curve culminates in the most awe-inspiring of them all, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Asimov doesn't hold back his admiration, calling it, and I quote, the noblest architectural achievement in the world. And honestly, who could argue with that? This wasn't just a tomb. It was a statement, a testament to human capability that has stood for millennia.
It's hard to even grasp the scale of it all, right? 2.3 million blocks of stone, each weighing tons, all meticulously cut and fitted together without the aid of modern technology. It's no wonder it's the last remaining wonder of the ancient world.
I know.
It's like staring at a mountain, knowing that it was built by hand by people who lived thousands of years ago. You can practically feel the weight of history, can't you?
You can almost hear the echoes of their tools, the ingenuity it took to align these massive structures with the stars. But Asimov, ever the pragmatist, reminds us that even the most magnificent achievements have a cost. The resources, the labor, the sheer effort poured into pyramid construction, it strained the Old Kingdom.
It's like they built their way to success and then almost bricked themselves into a corner.
Almost.
So we have this picture of a civilization at its peak, building wonders of the world. But Asimov doesn't let us forget that no empire, no matter how mighty, lasts forever. And that's where things take a turn, right?
That's right. Just as you start to think the Egyptians have this whole civilization thing figured out, Asimov introduces a group that throws a wrench into the works. The Hyksos. Imagine you're an Egyptian living at this time. You've heard stories about your ancestors uniting Upper and Lower Egypt, building these incredible pyramids, pushing the boundaries of human achievement. Your civilization feels almost invincible.
And then suddenly you're facing an enemy you know nothing about, who seemed to have appeared out of thin air. It must have been terrifying. Who were these mysterious Hyksos, and how did they manage to conquer a civilization as powerful as Egypt?
That's the biggest mystery of all. Asimov points out that later pharaohs basically tried to erase the Hyksos from history, like they were trying to pretend this embarrassing defeat never happened.
Talk about adding insult to injury, right? They conquer you and then try to erase you from history. But surely there are clues, whispers in the archaeological record that tell us something about these conquerors. What was their secret weapon?
Well, Asimov suggests that the Hyksos had a technological edge that the Egyptians simply weren't prepared for: horses and chariots. Can you imagine being an Egyptian soldier used to fighting on foot and suddenly you're facing these fast-moving, highly mobile units?
It would be like fighting a completely different kind of war, one they had no experience with. It's fascinating how this one technological innovation could shift the balance of power so dramatically. It makes you realize how important adaptability is for a civilization's survival. But the Egyptians, they weren't ones to back down from a challenge, were they?
You're right. They eventually adopted the Hyksos' own tactics, mastered the use of chariots, and eventually drove the invaders out. It's a testament to their resilience, their ability to learn and adapt, even in the face of defeat. And this victory ushered in a new era for Egypt, one marked by expansion and conquest, the New Kingdom.
Okay, so they face down an existential threat, come out stronger, and now they're ready to flex their muscles a bit. Where do they go from here?
Asimov highlights pharaohs like Thutmose III, a military genius who led campaigns that stretched from modern-day Syria to Nubia. He wasn't content with just defending Egypt's borders. He wanted to create an empire. And he did just that, transforming Egypt into the dominant power in the region.
It's like they took the lessons learned from their conflict with the Hyksos and applied them on a grand scale. They embraced new military technologies, consolidated their power, and then went on to build an empire that rivaled some of the greatest in history. But even during this period of expansion and dominance, there were internal struggles, weren't there? Asimov introduces us to a pharaoh who tried to change everything, Akhenaten.
Yes, Akhenaten, the heretic king. This wasn't just about expanding borders. This was about reshaping the very fabric of Egyptian society, starting with their religion. He was obsessed with the sun disk, Aten, and decided that all other gods were out. Imagine the upheaval this caused. Centuries of tradition and belief overturned by one pharaoh's vision.
It's like he looked at this incredibly complex belief system with its animal-headed gods and elaborate rituals and thought, nope, it's all about the sun now. That's a bold move, even for a pharaoh.
Yeah,
but you said it caused upheaval. Did this religious revolution stick?
Asimov points out that while Akhenaten's reforms were radical, they ultimately failed. He was a visionary, maybe even a bit of an idealist, but he underestimated the power of tradition and the resistance to such a dramatic shift in belief. After his death, Egypt reverted to its old ways, and Akhenaten's name was practically erased from history. It's as if the very civilization he tried to reshape decided to hit the undo button on his reign.
It makes you think about the limits of power, even for a pharaoh. But Akhenaten wasn't the last pharaoh to leave his mark on history, was he? Asimov saves perhaps the most famous pharaoh for last, Ramses II. What makes Ramses stand out in Asimov's narrative?
Ramses II was the embodiment of pharaonic power. He had a reign even longer than Pepi II, filled with ambitious building projects, military campaigns, and a determination to be remembered as the greatest pharaoh of them all. Think of him as the Egyptian equivalent of a rock star, a larger-than-life figure who dominated his era.
And like any good rock star, he had a few epic battles under his belt, right?
Exactly. Asimov focuses on the Battle of Kadesh, where Ramses faced off against the Hittites, a powerful empire in their own right. He supposedly led his troops to a glorious victory, but Asimov throws in this intriguing detail. The actual outcome is still debated by historians. Did Ramses exaggerate his triumph? Did he spin a good story for the history books? It makes you realize that history is often written by the victors, and even with all the evidence we have, some mysteries remain unsolved.
It's a good reminder to always question the official narrative, even when it comes to ancient history. But Ramses' reign, as long and impressive as it was, marked a turning point, didn't it?
Unfortunately, it did. Asimov highlights a trend that began under Ramses II, one that has echoes throughout history: the increasing reliance on mercenaries in the Egyptian army. It seems the Egyptians, after centuries of being at the forefront of warfare, have become a bit too comfortable.
They got a taste of their own medicine, so to speak, with the Hyksos invasion, but then they fell back into old habits. It makes you wonder, did they become complacent? Did they start to believe their own hype?
It's a question worth considering, because, as Asimov illustrates, this reliance on foreign soldiers, while seemingly practical in the short term, eroded the very core of Egyptian strength. They became dependent on outsiders to defend their borders, a sign that the once mighty empire was beginning to crumble from within.
So what happens next? Does Egypt manage to pull itself back from the brink? Or is this the beginning of the end for one of history's greatest civilizations?
Unfortunately, as Asimov tells it, the decline of the New Kingdom is a slow but steady downward spiral. They never regain the dominance they once enjoyed, and eventually they fall prey to a series of conquests. The Libyans, the Nubians, even the Assyrians all take their turn ruling over the once mighty Egyptians. It's a sobering reminder that even the most powerful empires are not immune to the tides of history.
So, after all, we've learned about ancient Egypt, their innovations, their struggles, their triumphs, and their falls. What does Asimov leave us with? What's the takeaway from this deep dive into a civilization that vanished millennia ago?
Asimov doesn't give us easy answers. He doesn't offer a simple list of lessons learned or a prescription for how to avoid the mistakes of the past. Instead, he leaves us with something far more powerful a question. He asks, given Egypt's long history and its cyclical rises and falls, what lessons can we draw from their story and apply to the challenges facing civilizations today?
It's a question that stays with you long after you finish reading The Egyptians. It makes you look at the world around you, at the challenges we face as a global civilization, and wonder, are we doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past? Or can we learn from the Egyptians and chart a different course, one that leads to a more sustainable and just future?
And that's the beauty of Asimov's work. He doesn't just tell us about the past. He compels us to think about the present and the future. He reminds us that history isn't just a collection of names and dates. It's a reflection of ourselves, our flaws, our potential, and our enduring capacity for both greatness and folly.
It's been an incredible journey exploring ancient Egypt through the lens of Asimov's insights. It's a reminder that even though millennia separate us from the pharaohs and pyramids, the echoes of their civilization still resonate with us today.
And perhaps, by understanding their story, their triumphs and their failures, we can gain a deeper understanding of our own.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning from the past.